Deaths and burials of the kings and queens of England, the Hanoverians and the Windsors. All men must die, even kings, and not even a golden crown can pay off the Grim Reaper. In this 4-part series, we'll bid a final farewell to all 58 deceased English and British monarchs, from Æthelstan to Elizabeth II. We'll dig up their medical records and deathbed secrets, uncover where and how they were buried, and reveal if their remains rest in peace. In this episode, we'll go 20 feet under to explore the royal vault and the deaths of the Hanoverian, Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, and Windsor monarchs. While modern medicine made reigns longer and most deaths more peaceful, the elaborate royal funeral traditions we see today emerged. And now let's offer our condolences to the Hanoverians. George I was the Prince Elector of Hanover in Germany. In his youth, he'd had a tumultuous marriage with Sophia Dorothea of Salle. She grew tired of his philandering and dared to take a lover of her own. Her man was murdered, possibly on George's orders. Then the prince unquestionably had Sophia imprisoned for the rest of her life. George was 54 when he was made King of Great Britain. He didn't speak a word of English and detested his new kingdom. He left its governing to the first Prime Minister, Sir Robert Walpole, while he made frequent trips back to his beloved Hanover. On his 6th visit, the 67-year-old king suffered a stroke while riding in his carriage. He was rushed to his younger brother's palace, where he died 2 days later. According to legend, the king's cranial blood vessel burst after reading a letter from his recently deceased estranged wife, Sophia Dorothea, in which she cursed him for his years of cruelty. George I was buried in the chapel of Lehn Palace in Hanover. During World War II, the palace was burned by the Allies, and the remains of George and his parents were moved to the mausoleum of King Ernst Augustus in Herrenhausen Gardens. George I was the last British monarch to be buried outside of the UK. George II hated his father for his ill treatment of his mother and for keeping him impotent in politics. When he was given Daddy's will, he pocketed it, so his mistresses didn't get a penny. George II liked Britain, and after he was crowned at 47, he made a bit of an effort. He in turn despised his own son, Prince Frederick. He sent his second son, William, Duke of Cumberland, to put down a rebellion in Scotland, led by James VII and II's grandson, Bonnie Prince Charlie. Highlanders were slaughtered at the Battle of Culloden. At 44, Prince Frederick was struck in the chest by a real tennis ball, much harder than the rubber balls used today. It was long thought that this caused a lung abscess, which burst, but his death is now attributed to a pulmonary embolism. George outlived his son by 9 years. By 77, he was blind in one eye and hard of hearing. On the morning of October 25, 1760, the king followed his usual routine of rising at 6 a.m., drinking a cup of hot chocolate, and going into his closed stool, aka toilet. After a few minutes, his valet heard a loud crash and entered the room to find the king on the floor. George was lifted into bed, and his daughter, Princess Amelia, was sent for. Before she reached him, he was dead. The autopsy revealed that George died of a thoracic aortic dissection. He was buried in Westminster Abbey next to his beloved wife, Caroline of Ansbach, who had died 23 years earlier. The sides of their coffins were removed and placed flush together, so their dust could mingle for all eternity. George III was 22 when he succeeded his grandfather. He preferred a quiet domestic life with his wife, Charlotte, and their 15 children. His reign saw the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the establishment of Australia as a penal colony, the forced incorporation of Ireland into the United Kingdom, and the Enclosures Act, which took common land from the poor and fenced it off to make the rich richer. In his late 20s, the king began to display signs of mental illness. The episodes increased in severity, frequency, and length. George talked incessantly, foamed at the mouth, rampaged through the palace, and hugged his loved ones tightly and refused to let go. The episodes disturbed Queen Charlotte, and she moved herself and their children to another building on the grounds of Kew Palace. The exact nature of the king's illness is not known. Historians long theorized that he suffered from porphyria, an hereditary blood disease which has the odd side effect of turning one's urine purple. However, this theory is now widely dismissed in favor of a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. In 2005, a sample of George's hair was found to contain high levels of arsenic, which might have triggered his episodes. The toxic substance may have come from his medicines or cosmetics. The king was subject to brutal, primitive medical treatments. He was restrained, bled, force-fed experimental drugs, slathered in caustic poultices to draw out evil humors, and refused a fire in the freezing winter. Despite the torture, the king recovered his senses several times and returned to work. During a lucid episode, he faced the fact that the vault under Westminster Abbey was crammed with his ancestors. In 1810, he ordered the construction of a new royal vault, 20 feet below St. George's Chapel, Windsor. The 70 by 28-foot cavernous crypt ensured a final resting place for he, his wife, their many children, and generations of royals to come. Later that year, George's younger daughter, Amelia, died of tuberculosis. He was utterly distraught, and sensing that his mental health was falling apart again, he consented to putting his eldest son, George, in power as Prince Regent. He never recovered his mental health and lived in seclusion at Windsor Castle for a decade. The king was blind with cataracts, going deaf, and in constant pain from rheumatism. He developed dementia and was incapable of understanding when his wife died in 1818. At Christmas 1819, he spoke nonsense for 58 hours. George III died of pneumonia at 81. He was buried in the royal vault at Windsor, next to Charlotte. At 59 years on the throne, he is the longest reigning British king in history. George IV was fundamentally self-interested. He ate and drank incredible quantities, secretly married his mistress, and spent obscene amounts on clothes and luxury decor. He made himself out to be the hero of the Napoleonic Wars, when it was really his brilliant military leaders, Wellington and Nelson, who won back Europe. The Prince Regent did nothing to help his people navigate the seismic shifts of the Industrial Revolution. He was hugely unpopular and was the frequent subject of vicious cartoons. The country's hope for the future was his only legitimate child, Charlotte. But all hope was dashed when she died in childbirth at 21. The entire country mourned, and black fabric sold out. George suffered several weight and alcohol-related maladies, including arteriosclerosis, edema, and dropsy. He weighed 280 pounds, not nearly as much as King Henry VIII, who topped 400, but Henry was 6'2", while George was only 5'1". In 1813, workers building the royal vault accidentally broke into the vaults containing the lead coffins of Henry VIII, Jane Seymour, and Charles I. The Prince Regent oversaw the opening of their coffins. Charles I's body was partially mummified. Henry and Jane were both skeletal, though Henry's beard was visible. This incident was used to mock the unpopular Prince Regent. A cartoon shows him admiring the corpse of Henry VIII for being able to get rid of so many wives when George couldn't rid himself of one. When George III finally died and the Prince Regent was officially king, he planned an over-the-top and perversely expensive coronation. When his long-estranged wife, Caroline of Brunswick, showed up to be crowned, he had the doors of Westminster Abbey shut in her face. She died 3 weeks later, and George ordered her body to be quietly taken back to Germany. But Londoners rioted, seized her coffin, and paraded it through the streets. Ashamed and terrified of being attacked, George avoided being seen in public. By 60, he was almost completely blind from cataracts. He had severe bladder pain, and the gout in his right hand was so excruciating he could no longer sign documents. He took laudanum for the pain, as much as 100 drops before state occasions, which left him mentally impaired. He was also showing signs of the mental decline that had claimed his father. George spent his final years confined to his bedchamber. Attacks of breathlessness forced him to sleep upright in a chair. Doctors frequently pierced his abdomen to drain excess fluid. But his will to live and prodigious appetite astonished observers. The Duke of Wellington recorded that the king consumed for breakfast a pigeon, a beefsteak pie, a bottle of Moselle, a glass of dry champagne, 2 glasses of port, and a glass of brandy, followed by a large dose of laudanum. In his final days, George found religion and repented his dissolute life. On June 26, 1830, he woke up at 3 a.m., went to the toilet, then called for his page. While grasping his guts, he exclaimed, "This is death." And so it was. George was 67. His autopsy found that he had died from a gastric rupture. A tumor the size of an orange was found on his bladder. His heart was enlarged, with heavily calcified valves and a huge fatty deposit. At his funeral, the crowd outside St. George's Chapel was so jolly that the service had to be rushed through. His brother, William IV, was an old Navy man and tried to win back support by doing things on the cheap. But, like his brother, he prevented badly needed government reform, which benefited the aristocracy over the common people. With the country on the brink of revolution, William was forced to sign the Reform Act of 1832. Though the king had fathered 10 children with his longtime mistress, actress Dorothea Jordan, his 5 children with his queen, Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen, had all died in infancy. Thus his heir was his niece, Victoria. The king tried to build a relationship with her, but was thwarted by her grasping mother. At his 71st birthday banquet, William humiliated the Duchess by exclaiming, "I trust to God that my life will be spared for 9 months longer. I should then have the satisfaction of leaving the royal authority to that young lady, and not in the hands of a person who is surrounded by evil advisers and is herself incompetent to act with propriety." Though mortally ill, William did indeed live just 1 month past Victoria's 18th birthday. He took to his bed with congestive heart failure and bronchopneumonia. Queen Adelaide stayed at his side and refused to sleep for 10 days. William died at Windsor Castle and was buried in the royal vault. Victoria was thrilled to be free of her mother. She fell in love with her handsome German cousin, Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, and they had 9 children. Her reign saw massive technological advancements as the Industrial Revolution was in full swing. After 21 years of marriage, Albert contracted typhoid fever and died at 42. Victoria was heartbroken and spent the next 40 years in mourning, popularizing many death traditions, including wearing black. She retreated from public life and spent her time lost in memories at Windsor and Balmoral castles. Her closeness to a servant, John Brown, raised many eyebrows. Depression drove her to seek comfort in food, and her weight limited her mobility. Many wondered why their tax money was paying for a queen who didn't work. But the government saw a use for her as the maternal face of the expanding British Empire, and her 9 children made useful political marriages. Victoria became known as the grandmother of Europe. Her 60-year Diamond Jubilee was celebrated with a parade. The Queen sat in an open carriage and stopped for a service of Thanksgiving in front of St. Paul's, so she wouldn't have to walk up the cathedral steps. Victoria spent every Christmas at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. She died there on January 22, 1901, surrounded by her family and with her Pomeranian, Turi, on her bed. She was 81 and broke her grandfather's record for longest reign. As she had been a bit obsessed with death, she had planned her own funeral in advance. She was dressed in white, including her lace wedding veil, and surrounded by mementos, such as Prince Albert's dressing gown and a plaster cast of his hand. A lock of John Brown's hair and a picture of him were placed in her left hand and concealed from view by a bouquet of flowers. She took a lot of her bling with her. She had rings on every finger, and her neck and wrists were stacked with necklaces and bracelets. She wanted to be buried as a soldier's daughter, so a gun carriage conveyed her coffin. A harness snapped, spooking the horses, and the royal coffin nearly shot down the hill. But a contingent of sailors stepped in to pull the coffin, a tradition which remains to this day. Victoria was buried in a mausoleum at Frogmore House on the grounds of Windsor Castle, next to her beloved Albert. Now let's bid a final farewell to the Saxe-Coburg and Gothas, aka Windsors. Edward VII was the opposite of his prudish parents. He loved people, partying, and over 50 paramours. His beautiful wife, Alexandra of Denmark, looked the other way. Their eldest son, Prince Albert Victor, also a playboy, died at 28 during an influenza pandemic. Edward was 59 when he came to the throne. He had liberal ideas. He spoke against racism and supported laborers, but was opposed to votes for women. However, he didn't get much done in his 9-year reign. His habit of smoking 20 cigarettes and 12 cigars a day caused a rodent ulcer on his nose, which was cured with radium. He suffered from bronchitis. He fainted during a state trip to Germany and again while vacationing in the south of France. He was transported back to Buckingham Palace, and his wife, who had been on her own vacation in Greece, returned a week later. The next day, the king suffered several heart attacks. He refused to go to bed, saying, "No, I shall not give in. I shall go on. I shall work to the end." Between moments of faintness, his son George told him that his horse, Witch of the Air, had won at Kempton Park. The king replied, "Yes, I have heard of it. I am very glad." His final words. At 11 p.m., he lost consciousness and was put to bed. He died 15 minutes later. He was 68. Alexandra refused to allow him to be moved for 8 days. Finally, Edward was dressed in his naval uniform and moved to the throne room, where he lay in state, with 4 guardsmen standing at each corner of his massive oak coffin. After 3 days, he was placed on a gun carriage and pulled to Westminster Hall, with his family and his favorite dog, Caesar, walking behind. Following the service, the royal family left, and the hall was open to the public. 400,000 people filed past the coffin over 2 days. Finally, Edward was taken by train to Windsor Castle, where he was buried in St. George's Chapel, under a marble monument he would later share with Alexandra. George V was 45 and a crusty old naval man. He married his older brother's fiancée, Mary of Teck, and they had 6 children. In 1914, the UK went to war with his cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm. With Germany so unpopular, George made the prudent decision to change his family name from Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to Windsor, the name of his favorite English castle. Fear prevented him from saving his cousin, Tsar Nikolai II of Russia, who was later gunned down in a basement with his wife and 5 children. Southern Ireland became a republic, and Australia, Canada, South Africa, and other countries became independent. The war and the crumbling of the empire took a toll on George's health. His heavy smoking caused chronic bronchitis. He fell seriously ill with septicemia, and his abdomen was drained. But he cussed out anyone who suggested he take a break to recuperate. In January 1936, he went to his bed at Sandringham House, complaining of a cold. For 5 days, he drifted in and out of consciousness. His last words were, "God damn you," to a nurse who gave him a sedative at night. The private diary of his physician, Lord Dawson, was made public in 1986. It revealed that the doctor was distraught at seeing the royal family in anguish, waiting for the unconscious George to die, and he felt it more appropriate for the death of the sovereign to be announced in the morning edition of the Times, rather than the vulgar evening journal. So he took it upon himself to quietly inject the king in the jugular vein with morphine and cocaine, ending his life peacefully. Composer Paul Hindemith wrote morning music in 6 hours, and it was played on the BBC the next day while the nation mourned. George's 4 surviving sons stood guard around their father's coffin the night before his funeral. The Vigil of the Princes is still performed today. During the funeral procession, the cross surmounting the imperial state crown atop George's coffin fell off and landed in the gutter. The new king, Edward VIII, wondered if it was a bad omen for his own reign. George V was interred at St. George's Chapel in a marble tomb he later shared with his wife Mary. Edward VIII was a 32-year-old playboy and was more interested in his married American mistress, Wallis Simpson, than in being king. The government wouldn't stand for the head of the church marrying a divorcee and a Nazi sympathizer. Edward was given a choice, Wallis or the crown. He chose Wallis and abdicated after only 11 months, shocking the nation. He spent the rest of his life aimlessly moving around the world and demanding of his family a larger allowance and that Wallis be called Her Royal Highness. In his late 60s, Edward had an operation for an aneurysm and for a detached retina. Smoking since his teens caused lung cancer. Still, he outlived his brother by 2 decades, yet another source of family resentment, as Edward was blamed for the stress he had dumped on George. In 1972, Queen Elizabeth II visited her uncle at his friend's chateau, and they talked for 15 minutes. The ex-king died 10 days later. His body was returned to Britain, and he was buried behind the Victoria and Albert Mausoleum at Frogmore. The Queen quietly supported Wallis, who died of dementia in 1986 and was buried next to her husband. George VI was a painfully shy man with a stutter who had never expected to be king. He enjoyed a quiet life with his wife, Elizabeth, and their 2 daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret. But the family was thrust into the spotlight just as Britain entered World War II. The royals remained in London even when Buckingham Palace was bombed. The king and queen worked tirelessly to support the war effort. When Britain won, the royals were at their most popular. George ruled another 7 years, but the stress of the conflict and smoking devastated his health. He was diagnosed with lung cancer and also suffered arteriosclerosis and Buerger's disease. An arterial blockage caused him to lose feeling in his right leg. A lumbar sympathectomy saved the limb from amputation. Next, his right lung was removed. It was decided that Princess Elizabeth and her new husband, Philip, would go on a Commonwealth tour in the King's place. Against his doctor's advice, George went to London Airport to bid them farewell. Then he, his wife, and Margaret went to Sandringham, had a happy family dinner, and looked at photo albums. The next morning, the king was found dead in his bed. He had died of a coronary thrombosis at 56. Elizabeth, now queen, cut her tour short and returned home to bury her father. He was initially placed in the royal vault, but his daughter built a new chapel in St. George's with a vault for 3 monarchs and their consorts. George was reburied there in 1969 under a simple Belgian marble slab. In 2002, his wife, who lived to the age of 100, was placed with him, as was his daughter, Margaret, who opted to be cremated so her remains could fit in the tight vault with her parents. Elizabeth II was 26 when she was crowned on television. Her youth and glamour brought hope to Britons still recovering from the war. She and her husband, Prince Philip of the Greek and Danish royal family, had 4 children: Charles, Anne, Andrew, and Edward. 3 of them shocked the nation with scandalous affairs and divorces. In 1997, Charles's ex-wife, Princess Diana, died in a car crash. The Queen's lack of public response was viewed as cold. But through the ups and downs of politics and public opinion, Queen Elizabeth remained a stalwart force of unity in Britain and the Commonwealth. With the jet age, she has been able to visit dozens of countries in person. In 2013, just in time for the birth of Prince William and Catherine's first child, a new Succession to the Crown Act gave women equality in the succession. In 2021, Elizabeth buried her husband, Philip, who died at 99. In 2022, she celebrated her 70th Platinum Jubilee, far surpassing her great-great-grandmother Victoria's record for longest reigning monarch in British history. In August 2022, the Queen went on her usual summer trip to Balmoral Castle in Scotland. On September 6th, the newly appointed Prime Minister, Liz Truss, made the journey north to meet the frail sovereign. These would be the last public photos of the Queen. 2 days later, her doctors called her family to her bedside. Prince Charles, his wife Camilla, and his sister Anne were nearby. They, a minister from the local church, and the Queen's senior dresser, spent time with her at her deathbed. Charles went out to get some fresh air and pick mushrooms. While he was gone, his mother slipped away peacefully at 3:10 p.m. Other family members, Princes William, Andrew, and Edward, and his wife Sophie, and separately Prince Harry, had to take planes from London and speed the hour from the airport to Balmoral. They did not make it in time to say goodbye. Her death certificate records cause of death as old age, but it has been reported that the 96-year-old monarch was also suffering multiple myeloma, a bone marrow cancer. Operation London Bridge, the detailed plans for the Queen's death, swung into action. On the 10th, the Accession Council, which has roots in Anglo-Saxon times, met at St. James's Palace to proclaim King Charles III. Royal undertakers Levertson and Sons prepared the Queen's remains. Her coffin, made of oak grown on the Sandringham estate, was draped in the royal standard and driven to the Palace of Holyrood House in Edinburgh. From there, she was conveyed up the Royal Mile to St. Giles Cathedral for a service and vigil, during which the Crown of Scotland was placed on her coffin. Next, she was flown to Buckingham Palace in London. The imperial state crown, orb and scepter, and a wreath from her family adorned her coffin. She was conveyed to Westminster Hall to lie in state for 4 days. 250,000 people filed past her coffin. Her 4 children and 8 grandchildren performed vigils of the princes. On September 19th, the UK got a bank holiday. Elizabeth's coffin was conveyed to Westminster Abbey, where heads of state and foreign royals attended her funeral, which was broadcast worldwide. Her coffin was placed on the same gun carriage that had conveyed her father and pulled by 138 sailors to Hyde Park Corner. From there, a hearse transported the Queen to Windsor Castle. Another service was held at St. George's, and the world watched as the Queen was lowered down the catafalque into the royal vault, as a bagpipe played the mournful tune, "Sleep, Dearie, Sleep." Later, the royal family attended a private service, during which the coffins of both Elizabeth and Philip were raised out of the royal vault, then reburied in their final resting place, below the George VI Memorial Chapel. Want even more tea on history? Check out the History Tea Time podcast. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, comment your thoughts, and check out my other history videos. You can also join my Patreon to support my work and get early access to all of my multi-part series. Thank you for watching.